Whenever you hook up your PS5 to a new HDR-capable TV for the first time, you'll eventually be greeted by this Adjust HDR screen containing the symbol of a sun against a white background. But did you know that one common picture setting, enabled by default in game mode on many modern HDR TVs, can actually trick you into adjusting this test pattern wrongly, leading to HDR games looking brighter than intended, with potentially blown out highlight detail? Let me demonstrate. Here, I'm not touching the PS5 controller at all, and you can just about make out the faint outline of the sun. But the moment I change just one picture setting on this LG OLED TV, the sun suddenly becomes much easier to see. Nothing has changed on the PS5. The only thing I've altered is a single TV setting. If I now follow the best practice guidelines and keep increasing the brightness until the sun disappears, I'll end up selecting a higher value than I should. In other words, the TV has just convinced the PS5 that it's brighter than it really is, and the PS5 simply believes it without questioning, a bit like me when the mechanic says your brake pads need replacing. So why does this happen? To answer that, we first need to understand what the PS5's Adjust HDR screens are actually doing. Fundamentally, HDR movies and HDR console games work differently. When you watch an HDR movie, the source tells the TV how bright the content was mastered to, allowing the TV to tone map the image if it's brighter than what the TV can reproduce. However, when playing HDR games on consoles, the PS5 doesn't send this HDR mastering information to the TV at all, so it first needs to learn your TV's HDR capabilities during the setup process, which is exactly the purpose of these Adjust HDR screens on the PS5. Every click upwards increases the HDR signal level of the sun. When the sun completely disappears into the background, known as the clipping point, the PS5 uses this to determine the HDR brightness target it should aim for in compatible HDR games. The second screen, for example, determines what's known as max TML or maximum tone map luminance, which defines the HDR peak brightness target the PS5 should tone map to. This entire process relies on one critical assumption, that your TV is displaying the incoming HDR video signal faithfully. But if the TV alters that signal during calibration, the clipping point moves. The PS5 doesn't know the TV has changed anything. It simply stores the new value, believing it to be correct. Every compatible HDR game then starts from the wrong HDR brightness target. As demonstrated in the intro of this video, the culprit picture setting is dynamic tone mapping, which is enabled by default in the HDR game mode on many modern HDR TVs. Dynamic tone mapping continuously analyzes the incoming HDR signal and remaps its luminance to the display in real time. During the PS5 calibration process, this means the TV is no longer displaying the signal exactly as the console generated it. The clipping point keeps shifting, meaning you're effectively calibrating against a moving target. As a result, the PS5 stores HDR brightness values that no longer accurately represent your TV's true HDR capability. Before I show you how to configure your TV correctly, here's a quick word from today's sponsor. Whenever I'm traveling abroad to attend TV launches or trade shows, one app I consistently use is UBG, which lets you download an eSIM data plan across more than 200 destinations. The funny thing is, I had already used UBG purely off my own research when I went to Tokyo for a Sony media briefing 2.5 years ago, long before UBG approached me for this paid collaboration. What I really like is that you can set everything up before leaving your country. I installed the eSIM at home, and upon landing, all I had to do was select UBG as my mobile data source and enable data roaming. It activated automatically, and I was online straight away, without queuing for a physical SIM card or fiddling with tiny SIM trays. And because I'm using UBG for my mobile data, there are no surprise roaming charges from my usual carrier. So if you want a reliable, stress-free way to stay connected on your next trip, download the UBG app and use my promo code HDTV test for a 10% discount. I've put the link in the YouTube description below. Thanks again for your support. Now, let's configure your TV so the PS5 sees its true HDR capabilities. If your TV supports HDRG, this is the easiest and most accurate method. Enable the HDRG setting on your TV first. Unlike dynamic tone mapping, HDRG disables the TV's own dynamic HDR processing, allowing the PS5's calibration patterns to be displayed faithfully, exactly as the console intended. You can now follow the HDRG best practice guidelines with confidence. On the first and second adjust HDR screens, keep pressing upwards until the sun first disappears into the white background. Once it disappears, stop. Don't keep clicking. This isn't one of those dodgy websites with 6 fake download buttons. These first two adjust HDR screens determine the console's HDR brightness targets, technically known as max FFTML and max TML. On the third screen, simply lower the value to the minimum setting. This corresponds to a min TML or minimum tone map luminance of 0 nits, preserving true blacks instead of unnecessarily raising the black floor however slightly. But what if your TV doesn't support HDRG or source-based tone mapping? Don't worry, there's still a workaround to get you in the ballpark. In that case, we can no longer trust the clipping point on the PS5's calibration screens, because the TV is modifying the signal before it reaches your eyes. Instead, use your TV's measured HDR peak brightness from a reliable independent source such as ratings.com, and refer to this chart I've derived using my Canon Professional Reference Monitor and its inbuilt HDR signal analysis tools. I've done the hard work so you don't have to. Which shows the number of clicks upwards from bottom corresponding to different HDR peak brightness values, allowing you to enter the correct max FFTML and max TML manually on the first and second adjust HDR screens without relying on a calibration pattern that's already being altered by the TV. Now, I realize not everyone knows their TV's measured HDR peak brightness, so here's a simple rule of thumb. If you're unsure, simply set both the first and second adjust HDR screens to 1000 nits, which corresponds to 15 clicks from the bottom. It's an excellent all-round baseline that works well on the vast majority of HDR televisions. There is one final complication. Some TVs, particularly recent Sony Bravia models, perform dynamic tone mapping at all times, and don't offer a true HDRG mode that completely bypasses it. In these cases, I generally recommend treating 1000 nits as the default target, or 1500 nits or 18 clicks from the bottom if you're using one of the brighter flagship mini LED models such as the Bravia 9 or Bravia 9 II. In my experience, this produces more consistent HDR than trying to calibrate against an ever-moving clipping point. So that's how to stop your TV from tricking your PS5 into storing the wrong HDR brightness values in the first place. For a more detailed technical comparison between HDRG and dynamic tone mapping, you can watch my explanation video by clicking here.